What's up, everybody? I'm here with Chapter 42 of Book 1 of the Ranger's Apprentice The Early Years series, The Tournament at Gorlan. Let's go ahead and get into it. The two contestants sat their horses at each end of the tilt. Their visors were lowered, and neither man moved. They resembled metal statues. Morgoth, in his all-black armor, relieved only by the patch of yellow on his breast and shield, and Errol in his dazzling blue with the gold boar's head on his shield that was his personal insignia. As they had ridden out to their starting positions, a hush had fallen over the crowd. Baron Naylor of Taft strode out to a position halfway down the tilt, and stood facing the western grandstand. He nodded to a herald who had accompanied him. The brightly garbed man raised his long trumpet and blew an echoing blast on it, the signal for silence. Although, with the sudden hush that had fallen over the spectators, the signal was unnecessary. Still, it was part of the ceremony of the joust, and so it was carried out. Naylor had a penetrating voice, one of the reasons he had been selected as Grand Marshal, and now he used it to its fullest extent. "My lords, ladies, noble knights, and citizens of the kingdom of Erluin, this will be a single combat, a challenge between Morgoth, Baron of Gorlan Fief, and Errol, Baron of Redmont Fief." He paused, gathering his breath, then continued, "The challenge has been issued by Lord Morgoth and accepted by Lord Errol. Both men have agreed that this passage of arms will be a résultat final." Now, a buzz of excitement ran through the crowd, particularly those in the public grandstand on the eastern side. Although many had heard rumors about the details of the challenge, this was the first time they had heard it officially confirmed. Naylor frowned. He was a somewhat pompous man, and he didn't like being interrupted. He turned and faced the eastern grandstand and its noisy inhabitants. Like a flock of starlings at sunset, he thought. The undercurrent of conversation continued, in spite of his withering glance. He gestured impatiently with his Grand Marshal's mace to the herald beside him. Again, the trumpet blew a shattering blast, which finally brought silence to the crowd. Naylor now looked to the end of the tilt, where Morgoth sat astride Warlock. The white horse was as unmoving as his rider. "Lord Morgoth, are you ready for combat?" Morgoth's face was covered by his helmet. Knowing that his voice would be muffled, he chose to signal his readiness by raising his lance vertically in his right hand, then allowing it to drop back into the socket on his right stirrup. Naylor turned to Errol's end of the field. "Lord Errol, are you ready for combat?" Errol mirrored Morgoth's signal, raising his lance, then lowering it again. His battle horse, Barnaby, flicked his tail at several errant flies, and trembled a muscle on his left shoulder. Otherwise, he too was unmoving. Naylor nodded, and paced toward the western grandstand, leaving the field of combat clear for the two barons. He turned to face them, and raised his mace toward the 3 additional heralds who were standing ready. 3 trumpets rose to 3 sets of lips, and the strident notes of the signal to begin rang out over the field. As the last note died away, both warriors drove their spurs into their horses' sides and thundered forward. In the same second, a massive cheer rose from the crowd. Individual cries could be made out here or there, encouraging either Morgoth or Errol, but for the most part, the crowd simply gave voice to a wordless shout of excitement. The thunder of the two horses' hoofs rose in intensity, and huge clods of torn turf were hurled into the air behind them as the massive beasts strained every muscle and sinew, striving for the maximum speed and power as they charged. The cries intensified as the two lances came down from their 45-degree angle to the horizontal. Some in the crowd had bet that one or the other of the riders would be unhorsed in the first pass, and they leaned forward eagerly now, as the collision was imminent. It came, a thundering crash of wood and metal, as the horses hurled themselves at each other on either side of the wooden fence that separated them. In this first pass, neither rider tried for anything more than a centered hit on the other's shield. This was a moment when they would assess each other's strength and timing and balance. As they came together, each lance was trapped by the concave shape of the opponent's shield. Both bent like bows until, in the same instant, they both shattered into hundreds of splinters, showering down on the riders as they crossed. A groan rose from those who had bet on the first pass being decisive. Then their voices were drowned by a swelling tide of cheering as the crowd, nobles and commoners alike, roared their encouragement. As they met, Harold had felt the shuddering impact of Morgoth's lance against his shield, and the inexorable force trying to hurl him back out of the saddle. He thrust forward against it, gripping his horse with all of the strength of his thigh muscles to retain his seat. Feeling the same savage pressure on his own lance as it locked on to Morgoth's shield. It had been a year since he last faced the black-clad baron on the tournament field, and he had forgotten the timing and power of the man's lance stroke. For a second, he thought the sheer force of the impact would hurl him back out of the saddle and onto the ground. Then both lances shattered at the same time, and he lunged forward, the backward pressure suddenly relieved. He shook his head. That had been a close call, he thought, but he felt that his own strike on Morgoth's shield had been nearly as forceful. Morgoth, for his part, cursed inside his helmet. Harold had hit him hard, harder than he'd expected. In the past year, Morgoth had dueled occasionally, but never with a knight as accomplished or as skilled, or as determined as his current opponent. For the first time, he felt a flicker of concern. Not fear, but simply the realization that he must not take Harold too lightly. That had been his mistake in the past. He knew he had hit Harold with the near-perfectly centered strike. A hit like that would have thrown most men out of the saddle, yet he had felt no movement from the blue and gold knight. He might need to change his tactics, he thought. He tossed the shattered stump of his lance to one side. Behind him, Harold was doing the same. Then they both checked and turned their horses at the end of the tilt. Harold's black horse reared onto its hind legs as he turned, but the Baron of Redmont sat him easily. He calmed the horse and waited till his attendant ran forward and passed him a new lance. The assistant marshal stationed at his end of the tilt stepped close to Barnaby's shoulder and called up to Harold. "Are you ready?" "Ready," called Harold, his voice muffled and echoing strangely, sounding like someone else. He stared past the slightly blurred bars of his visor to the other end of the field, where he saw Morgoth answering the same query. Both marshals raised their batons, and the heralds blew the signal to charge once more. Again, the cheering swelled with the thunder of horses' hoofs as the two straining animals churned the soft ground In an attempt to put as much force behind their charge as possible, Harold could hear his own breath rasping hollowly inside the helmet, above the background of his horse's pounding hoofs. His eyes were set on Morgoth's lance point as they approached, and it came down to the horizontal. Then he saw a slight waver. He suspected that Morgoth would try to end this combat quickly, that he would use his undoubted skill and precision to achieve a decisive blow with the lance. Even as he had the thought, he saw the tip of Morgoth's lance suddenly rise and center on his helmet, with only a few meters still separating them. 9 times out of 10, the ploy would have been successful. But Harold's premonition had prepared him, and his reflexes were lightning fast. Keeping his lance trained steadily on the center of Morgoth's shield, he swayed slightly to the right, allowing the Black Warrior's lance point to slide over his left shoulder. A fraction of a second later, Harold's lance hit Morgoth's shield and once again shattered with a splintering crack. Morgoth, slightly unbalanced after his own thrust met no resistance, swayed visibly in the saddle before he recovered and galloped on. Now the spectators shouted even louder. In a normal joust, such a pass would have put Harold at an advantage. His lance had shattered. Morgoth's had not. That would put Harold a point up. But this was to be fought à résultat final, so it really had no significance. It was a moral victory for Harold, but that was all. He slowed Barnaby, who was puffing and grunting with the effort of the 2 passes, and wheeled him at the end of the tilt, throwing his broken lance aside and taking a new one from his attendant. At the far end of the field, he saw Morgoth discarding his lance, and he frowned, a little puzzled. Morgoth's lance was undamaged. Why change it? Morgoth's attendant passed him a replacement. The black-clad warrior tested the heft and balance of the new weapon, then tossed it aside, gesturing for another. Maybe I've rattled him, Harold thought. He wondered if he might try a helmet strike himself this time, then discarded the idea. Morgoth was too wily an opponent, and he would probably be expecting such a move. Stay with what you're doing, Harold told himself. 2 good hits on the shield have unsettled him. Another one might do the trick. Baron Harold, are you ready? It was the marshal beside him, and he realized he'd already been asked the question and had given no answer. Stop wool-gathering, he told himself angrily. Ready, Harold replied. At the far end of the field, Morgoth finally seemed to be satisfied with the feel of his lance. He brandished it several times, testing the weight and the balance. Then, as the marshal asked him, he signified that he was ready for the next pass. Warlock had begun to toss his head and paw the ground at the delay. Morgoth tugged his head around and calmed him. The battle horse's blood was up, and the excitement of combat was making him agitated and eager to charge. Again, the 2 batons were raised. Again, the trumpets blared out, and once more the 2 combatants set off toward each other, digging in with their spurs and urging their massive steeds on to an even greater effort than before. The ground on either side of the tilt was torn and muddied now, after the horses had churned it in the 2 preceding passes. Their iron-shod hoofs had worn a track in the grass, leaving it more earth-brown than green. Clods and divots of turf littered the ground to either side, but that didn't diminish the enthusiasm or energy of the 2 horses. They pounded toward each other, not needing their riders' hands to aim them at each other. These were battle horses, bred, born, and trained for the role, and they were each totally intent on one thing: destroying the other, smashing him down, leaving him screaming with pain and frustration in the dirt. Once again, Harold was conscious of the roar of his own breathing and the accelerated pounding of his heart beneath the chain mail. He leaned forward, gripping with his thighs to guide Barnaby. Thunder of hoofs, roaring of the crowd, Morgarath, seen through the blurred bars of the visor, coming closer and closer, his lance point lowering. This time, there was no wavering. This time, Harold knew his shield would be targeted, and he braced himself for the impact, ready to thrust back as hard as he could. This time, he thought, I'll have him. They smashed together, with that same terrible, rending sound of wood and metal colliding. Harold felt his lance bend and then shatter. He heard splinters raining down on his helmet. Then, a fraction of a second later, as Morgarath's lance hit his shield, Harold realized that something was wrong. Terribly wrong. All right, that's going to be the conclusion of chapter number 42. As always, I want to thank you all for joining me. Thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you next time in chapter 43. God bless, and have a good one.